All right, let's dive right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different and honestly pretty fun. We're taking a journey through a student's incredibly detailed, handwritten biology study guide. Through these really meticulous notes, we're going to fundamentally reframe how we look at nature. Because nature, it isn't just this random, passive collection of plants and animals hanging out. No, it's a bustling, highly regulated, and honestly incredibly unforgiving global economy. And these notes are basically the perfect ledger to show us exactly how the whole shebang actually works. So, to make sense of all this dense biological data, we've broken it down into 5 key areas: the building blocks, the one-way energy flow, nature's recycling system, ecosystem relationships, and finally, population limits.
Starting off with Section 1, the building blocks of ecology. Let's lay the foundation.
Okay, so before we can start tracking the currency in our economy of nature, we need to know the rules and the players, right? Right at the top of the notes, we get this really crisp definition of ecology. It's the study of the interactions between organisms and their non-living environment. See, it's not just studying plants or animals in isolation. It's all about that absolutely crucial link between living, breathing organisms and the strictly non-living world that they completely, literally rely on to survive. Think of ecological organization like a giant set of Russian nesting dolls. We zoom out step by step. You start at the very bottom with just a single individual fish. Group a bunch of those similar fish together that can interbreed, and boom, you have a population. Now add in the jellyfish, the crabs, the coral, all these different populations interacting, and you've got a community. Next, we add in the non-living stuff, right? The water, the rocks, the pH levels. That brings us to an ecosystem. Zoom out even further to massive biomes, and eventually the biosphere, which is basically every single place on planet Earth where life exists. So the real takeaway here is understanding the split between the 2 main types of assets in the system. On one side, we have biotic factors. Think bio, meaning living. These are your active players: the deer, the squirrels, the bacteria, the fungi. On the flip side, we have abiotic factors. This is the non-living physical infrastructure. We're talking the sun, water, oxygen, temperature, and here's the kicker. The living biotic players are entirely at the mercy of that abiotic infrastructure. If the water dries up or the temperature spikes, the whole living economy just completely collapses. Moving on to Section 2, the one-way energy flow. This is nature's currency. In our natural economy, energy is the ultimate currency. But here's the thing, it's never recycled. It only flows in one direction, strictly governed by the inescapable laws of thermodynamics. Notice how the workforce is split up to handle this? At the base, we've got the producers, or autotrophs. These are your plants, algae, certain bacteria, and they literally mint the currency straight from sunlight, using photosynthesis. They convert light energy into chemical energy stored in glucose. Then you've got everyone else, the consumers, or heterotrophs. Because they can't make their own food, their one and only job is to acquire currency by eating it. They have to ingest other organisms just to build ATP and, stay alive. But here is the absolute harshest reality of this entire economy: the 10% rule. Every single time energy is transferred from one organism to whatever eats it, a massive 90% of that energy is just lost. Only 10% actually gets passed on to the next level. Think of it as this incredibly steep, unavoidable entropy tax mandated by the universe. I mean, it's an exchange rate so bad, it makes airport currency kiosks look downright generous. Those intense all-caps annotations from the student's study guide make it crystal clear exactly where that 90% goes. It's spent. It gets burned up in cellular respiration just to keep the organism functioning. It's constantly lost as heat to the surrounding environment, and it's expelled as waste. Only a tiny, tiny fraction of energy is actually stored in the physical tissues, the biomass, available for the next consumer up the food chain. And that is exactly why an ecosystem can comfortably support millions of blades of grass, but only a tiny handful of apex predators like hawks or wolves.
Section 3, nature's ultimate recycling system. How matter cycles on. So we've established that energy eventually just kind of fades away as heat. But physical matter, elements like carbon, water, and nitrogen, they have to be endlessly, flawlessly recycled for life to continue. The carbon cycle is this beautiful, continuous loop. Producers pull carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis to build their tissues. Consumers come along and eat those producers. Then both of them release carbon back into the air through cellular respiration. And when they die, decomposers like bacteria and fungi break them down, returning that carbon straight to the soil and air. It's literally an eternal motion machine of matter. Though, as the notes point out, human combustion of fossil fuels does add a huge, sudden influx of carbon back into this really delicate balance.
Now, the nitrogen cycle has a reputation for being notoriously complex, but we can actually break it down into 3 elegant steps. And it's driven almost entirely by specialized bacteria that act like microscopic chemical factories. First, nitrogen-fixing bacteria pull unusable nitrogen gas straight out of the air and fix it into the soil. They often live right inside the roots of legume plants. Second, nitrifying bacteria convert that into nitrates. That's the exact form plants can actually absorb to build crucial things like proteins and DNA. Finally, denitrifying bacteria act as the cleanup crew, converting leftover nitrates back into nitrogen gas to return to the atmosphere. It really is a perfect biological assembly line.
But nature's tendency to cycle and store materials can absolutely backfire. This brings us to a concept called biological magnification, or biomag. Because organisms store things in their tissues, any toxins that can't be metabolized, like the pesticide DDT or heavy metals, they just build up in their cells. Because higher-level consumers have to eat so many smaller organisms just to get enough energy, those toxins compound dramatically by the time they reach the top of the food chain. This is exactly why your doctor tells you to limit how much apex predator fish like tuna or swordfish you eat. You're basically absorbing all of their compounding biological debt.
Section 4, Relationships and Ecosystem Dynamics. Let's talk survival interactions. Let's pivot from the chemistry side of things to the social dynamics of the ecosystem. Organisms don't exist in a vacuum, right? To secure those highly limited resources we've been talking about, they have to navigate some really complex and sometimes ruthless relationships. This is symbiosis, which just means species living closely together. It basically boils down to 3 main interactions. First, commensalism. This is a +0 relationship. One species benefits, the other is completely unaffected. Think of a bird nesting in a tree. Then there's mutualism, a ++ scenario where both species genuinely benefit, like those nitrogen-fixing bacteria and the legume plants we just mentioned. And finally, parasitism. This is the +- relationship, where one gets the benefit by actively harming the host. It's a really great shorthand way to categorize how things survive.
And these relationships actually drive change over time. It's a process called ecological succession. If you start with bare rock, say right after a volcanic eruption, it looks completely lifeless. But then, resilient pioneer species like lichens move in. And lichens are actually a mutualistic team of fungi and algae. They literally break down the solid rock to form soil. That new soil allows grasses to grow. The grasses eventually die, making richer soil, which brings in shrubs, then pines, and finally leads to a highly biodiverse, stable forest known as a climax community. The ecosystem slowly, methodically, builds its own infrastructure from scratch. And our final section, Section 5, Population Growth and Limits, exploring the absolute limits of nature.
Understanding all this structure really begs a critical question. What happens when a population, literally any population, tries to grow infinitely within this highly finite, tightly regulated natural economy? Well, there's a stark contrast between exponential and logistic growth. On one hand, you have the sharp J-curve of exponential growth. This happens when resources are unlimited. The population simply explodes. But as we've seen, nature does not have unlimited resources. So reality almost always looks like logistic growth. The population grows really fast initially, but then resources get scarce and the growth levels off into an S-curve. That flat line at the top, that's the carrying capacity. It is the ecosystem's strict, absolute mathematical ceiling for how many individuals it can successfully support. So what exactly enforces that ceiling? Limiting factors. And we can categorize these into 2 pretty harsh realities. First are density-dependent factors. These hit way harder when a population is densely crowded. We're talking about disease spreading like wildfire, fierce competition for food, or attracting a whole lot more predators. The second are density-independent factors. These limit populations regardless of how crowded they are. Think natural disasters, a brutal winter, or a severe drought. The environment will use either or both of these to forcefully stop infinite growth. Which brings us to the ultimate question. We've been riding this massive J-curve of exponential human population growth for the past century, mostly thanks to agriculture, medicine, and tech. But our economy of nature is still absolutely governed by those finite cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and severely limited energy. With our population soaring and our carrying capacity reliant on a strictly finite biosphere, what happens when we become the ultimate limiting factor on our own ecosystem? It's a pretty profound question that this biological ledger suggests we are eventually going to have to answer. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.